Welcome back to Portrait of an Editor. I am Francis Lombard. After a few years away, Joe Illidge rejoins the podcast to talk about his work as executive editor for Heavy Metal. We cover a whole lot on this one, including when Joe first read Heavy Metal to what he would like to see more of in the magazine nowadays. So without further delay, here's Joe Illidge, executive editor for Heavy Metal. Enjoy. Hey Joe, welcome back to Portrait of an Editor. In my perfect research, I completely forgot when the last time we talked, but in memory, I know it wasn't before you were working for Heavy Metal, and I know it probably was before COVID, so we're looking at probably around 3 years.
That sounds about right. Yeah, the comic book industry was significantly different.
It was very different.
Last time we spoke.
Yeah, and I guess today, in some of the research I was doing, there's congratulations in order because it's your 2-year anniversary, according to LinkedIn.
Yes, it is. Can you believe it? Thank you so much.
So 2 years at Heavy Metal. I mean, I don't know. Have you gotten your fill of science fiction and naked women yet?
I'm never tired of those. Like my fill will come when I'm in the grave. So suffice it to say, I'm very cool to keep going with those and also throw in horror and fantasy because those are the 3 categories that Heavy Metal really specializes in. And, if you know Heavy Metal, then you know Tarna, right?
Yeah,
from the 1981 animated film. Those are pretty much part of my DNA. I remember discovering Heavy Metal in high school when I went to the High School of Art and Design. And I think it was while I was in the 10th grade, I was 13 years old, and I had an exclusive diet of Marvel and DC comics. And one of my friends showed me Heavy Metal magazine. And the first thing I saw was it was an installment of Ranxerox by Liberatore. And I was like, what is this? Because it didn't look like anything I had ever seen. It didn't look like George Perez or John Byrne or any of those things. And so that was really the beginning for me. And I was 13, so I didn't even dare think of buying Heavy Metal because I knew I would have to sneak it into the apartment. And if my mother found it, I would be in trouble, right? So I didn't become a purchaser of Heavy Metal until probably after college when I went to the School of Visual Arts. But I do remember watching the 1981 animated film, but not in the theaters. I saw it on VHS tape.
Yes, yeah. I think, that's where I saw it. I remember it was in the theaters when they used to do midnight shows. It was on a rotation and that.
Oh, wow.
But I was just too young to go. I would see it, flip through, and the newspaper would have the listing of the next town over where the movie theaters were. But it was Heavy Metal at night and, Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Exactly.
I think it may be Mad Max, but like the usual stuff that would rotate at the midnight screenings. But I know Heavy Metal would pop up, and maybe there was like drive-ins that would run dusk to dawn.
Man.
And dusk in Heavy Metal would be one of those. So in the summers, when I was a kid, let's go to the drive-in, because I think that's where I saw a lot of the movies, and Heavy Metal would pop up at some of these sleazier drive-ins, I guess. My parents aren't like, we're not going to that one. We'll go to the one, in the town over. I think I remember seeing like the Lord of the Rings, the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings show.
Man. Yeah, you're talking about like some really seminal films in animation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just great stuff. Now, what was the thing that you're worried about with your mom if she found you with a copy of Heavy Metal? What was it that
are you kidding? Because so my mom, she grew up Christian. She was born in Jamaica, and as a young girl, up until I think like 16, 17, she grew up in Nassau, Bahamas. So, my mom was not like hardcore, but she was definitely not what I would call advanced in the way that she would be comfortable with me seeing things that just openly engaged sexuality before I was 17 years old, right? I think my mother's standards were in perfect concert with the MPAA standards of when it would be appropriate for me to see things involving sex and nudity. And just to let you know, it's still on our queue to have a talk about the birds and the bees. We haven't
Oh,
totally scheduled that yet, but that's still coming.
oh, good. At least you guys are eventually going to get to it
Oh
after.
yeah, I know. Come on, that's an important one. You don't want to miss it. You can postpone it as much as you want, but eventually you're gonna get
Maybe after you get your AARP card or something. I
there.
don't know.
I think that would be perfect timing for it.
Just like opens up your schedule a bit. Once you get there.
Exactly.
Yeah, my story, like at Humanoids, when I got hired at Humanoids, I also started working. A new accountant got started working, and she was a little prim and proper. And at Humanoids, they have these huge, massive, pieces of art like Juan Jimenez and
hmm
whoever Mobius, but of course they're all the topless women. And
No
she's
doubt.
like, first month, she's like, oh, it's a little weird walking into this place, with all the nakedness. And then about 3 months in, she's like, I don't even notice it anymore. it's just
Yep.
it's just there. And
That's the reality of it.
yeah.
I'm actually impressed that she adjusted. I thought you were going to tell me she bolted. Like she
No,
couldn't.
no, she settled right in. Everybody sort of like became everybody really. I think she was the last like key into sort of the group sort of gelling, basically.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
she got what we were, what Humanoids was doing, what heavy metal was all about. She actually she was even more curious about the history and looking at the art and you know what it was about, and sort of how it was seen as high end instead of
hmm
just growing up probably reaching, she read Archie, she knew Spider-Man, and Batman and all that stuff, but this was a little different. So
No doubt. When you see stuff like the original Humanoids material, the original Metal Harlant magazines, heavy metal, it totally changes your perspective on what's possible with sequential art. And that's what it did for me. I experienced heavy metal before I experienced its what we'll call its offshoot, Epic Magazine by Marvel, before I experienced Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz's Elektra Assassin, before Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean's, I mean, anything, Violent Cases, Black Orchid, right? Like heavy metal was the first magazine, periodical to show me painted sequential art.
what about Miller's Ronin? Did you think that heavy metal prepped you for that, or how did you react to when Ronin came out?
So I'll tell you, when Ronin came out, I believe Ronin came out in 1983. I wasn't ready for it, right? I wasn't that person yet. I didn't like at that time when I was in high school, the most advanced thing that I was really engaging was Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? When I started going to college at School of Visual Arts, they had a library. And unlike any library I had ever seen at the time, SVA's library had graphic novels. And that was where I reconnected with Ronin and read the whole thing. And that was where I reconnected with Watchmen and read the whole thing. Heavy metal prepared me for Ronin in the sense that those kinds of European styles and influences were not totally alien to me. But in terms of engaging, mature content or experimental and daring content in the graphic novel form, that came during my early college years at School of Visual Arts.
So how does that all reconnect to you being executive editor for heavy metal? I know this is a large question, for the
Yeah.
last 2 years. I mean, so flash forward to where you are. When you sit down to sort of look at stuff, are you thinking about the young Joe and what would light up a new reader's head? I mean, I know I'm all over the place with the question, but
No, no, no. It makes perfect sense. So I will tell you this, the same way that when I looked at heavy metal upon first contact, when I was a student in high school, and no matter what page I looked at, the art was beautiful or the art was distinctive or it was different than anything I was seeing in American superhero comics, pretty much. That's what, I think about as executive editor. That's what our team thinks about, right? When we're thinking about the magazine, that number one, if you were to drop, if 10 people were to drop Heavy Metal magazine on the ground, no matter which pages it opens to, it's beautiful art, right? And then no two stories should look alike. So with every story, you're getting a different aesthetic experience. In that way, it does connect to really my first exposure with it. Right now, the market has changed. I honestly feel like this is a golden age of comic books. There are more comic books. There's more amazing stories. There's more unique visions. Superheroes are not dominating the direct market or the North American market. It's so many other genres. And so it's really about maintaining a high standard and just trying to have fun and experiment with different things that you wouldn't normally do. So, for example, our 45th anniversary issue is coming up in April, issue 316. There's something that we're going to do with a Tarna story. I don't want to spoil it because our publicist would choke me from afar. It wasn't something that I had intended when I originally commissioned and envisioned the story. But then when I saw the art, something did occur to me. And I said, you know what? This is perfect as is. So that'll be something that when it pops up in the magazine, that'll make that story different from any other story in the magazine, but it's going to be amazing regardless. And it's good to be able to have the creative freedom, to have the editorial freedom to do that, to pivot from an original plan in response to the artwork.
Can you hint at the art team? Can you mention who the team is, the creative team?
I cannot.
Okay.
I can tell you that it involves a well-beloved character for heavy metal fans, and leave it at that.
What about Milestone? Now, your work there, was there any discussion about heavy metal, the landscape that, Milestone was touching upon, or what, was there an influence of heavy metal there of where we can go storytelling wise? Because I think of like the, what is it? I always screwed up the name, but I did read the Ex-Zombie with the technology.
Yes.
Yeah, Zombie with the technology. And, it just like thinking about, Afrofuturism aspects of Milestone and everything. Was there any discussion about heavy metal or influence about heavy metal? Were people referring to that, or or is it just people are just doing their thing and just letting their influences boil ferment underneath?
I feel like it was indirect. I don't remember any conversations about heavy metal in particular. I can tell you that Dennis Cowan, one of the founders of Milestone, and he was creative director. One of the great things about Milestone is all of the founders had an open door policy. So their offices tended to be open. So whenever you would go to Dennis's office, he was usually drawing. When he was illustrating, you saw his library of books. And one of the artists who he really admired was Topé. When you think about an artist like Topé, when you think about Mobius, right? Those standards definitely made their way, I think, into our standards in terms of Milestone aspired and did succeed in being as revolutionary to culture and comics as heavy metal was to artistic aesthetic and mature content of comics. And, it was funny, like I mentioned Bill Sienkiewicz and Elektra Assassin a little while ago.
Yeah.
I still remember the day that Bill walked into the Milestone offices and he did this amazing painting. I think it was 36 by 48. And it was basically a painting of the major characters of the Milestone universe. And he did it for a window poster. It was printed as a window poster. It said Milestone on sale here. And it was for retailers to have in their stores. And this painting was just exquisite. And the way he depicted the Milestone characters made me think about heavy metal. it made me think about that standard, right? And if you look at that piece today, that still holds up today. So that's part of what heavy metal has to do. Heavy metal has to endure the times, and that comes from quality, right? A friend of mine, she told me this. I'll never forget it. I'll take it to the grave. It sounds simple, but it's really profound. She said, gimmicks don't last, quality endures. And I truly believe that. Something that is amazing is going to be amazing 10 years from now, 20 years from now. It may be amazing in a different context. It may not be amazing in a vacuum, but it's still going to be amazing.
Yeah, and you think about the history of comics, it's littered with, gimmicks, forgotten gimmicks.
100%.
But you think the quality of certain things, here we are talking about heavy metal, which has had up and downs and probably has experimented with gimmicks at times, but we're talking about, the influence it's had, for decades upon us, and just how it sort of hangs on to our head. And, some of the books we've talked about, which are all just, the quality of those books, Ronin and
Absolutely.
everything, coming back,
Absolutely. And you're talking about, heavy metal. The existence of heavy metal leads to the existence of vertigo,
yeah,
right? The existence of vertigo leads to the existence of image, right? So you can find the straight line and the branches from when heavy metal broke ground in the States in 1977 until now, right? 45 years later, you can track it and you understand how it was a pebble in the pond, and we're still seeing the ripple effects.
When I, thinking about heavy metal, for some reason in my head, it comes, Howard Chaykin's American Flag pops up
Oh my goodness.
as something that could be, is, part of that wave, that you're talking about, the next stage, what
Right.
First Comics was doing, even Mike Grell's John Sable, even though
That's
that
right.
doesn't feel like a heavy metal story, but it's a genre, you know, but it's an adult storytelling, with a, sort of tongue-in-cheek sense of humor at times, but also a very serious adult storytelling, especially when you think about Sable's origin and then what he's doing. And shoot, I he constantly bringing this up with my girlfriend about the John Sable going to Idaho to deal with extremists and
Yeah.
these guys. I was reading this stuff in the 80s, and here we are,
Listen.
serious stuff today.
The world has just caught up to American Flag. You realize
Yeah,
it, right?
yeah, I know. Yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
We've just caught up to the future that Howard predicted, right? And
Mhm.
showed us so long ago. And, another thing about like heavy metal and about art in comics, and I don't know how much this is part of the collecting culture anymore, but your level of geek cred was directly connected to the collections you had, the artists that you admired, what you were reading, right? So you had to be reading Doug Mensch and Bill Sienkiewicz's Moon Knight,
Mhm.
for example, right? Um, if you knew American Flag, you went up a notch, right? Because you were sophisticated on a different level. If you were aware of Alan Moore and Gary Leach's Miracle Man, right? Which would then, I think, go on to eventually Stephen Bissett, right? But these illustrators, knowing them was part of being a collector, right? Like the high art standards, even in Marvel and DC Comics. Again, Marvel would create Epic Magazine
Mhm.
and capture and try to capture the lightning in a bottle that heavy metal had, and they would have various black and white magazines like Deadly Hands of Kung Fu and Savage Sword of Conan, and they would have amazing illustrators like Alfredo Alcala and Rudy Nebres, right? So these are the kinds of things that were just happening, these artistic movements. And there was a bounty of amazing illustrators.
And it was all in the magazines. I mean, a lot of it was in the magazine, because I got towards,
Yes.
I was an Epic magazine collector, but there was also Bizarre Adventures, and
Bizarre Adventures. That's right.
let's do our violent issues. So they had the violence
Oh my
issue,
God, I remember that. Yeah,
and
I feel
I'm
like
like, could that
I
even
feel
be
like
done today? No,
I think that was issue 31 of
with the
Bizarre
woman
Adventures.
with the woman
Yeah,
with opening up her trench
yeah.
coat. Yeah,
Because 27 was the X-Men issue. There was a Phoenix story, an Iceman story, and a Nightcrawler story. And 28
I
had an
miss.
Elektra story that Frank Miller did.
Yeah, okay.
Issue 31 was the violent issue. Oh man, you're taking me back.
But it was all magazine stuff because and
Yes.
I guess because, and you can go. I was at a convention, I think maybe the second to last convention, but a bunch of the editors had worked on that, and they reminded me about it because one, you could get away with, you weren't under the censorship, so
That's right.
I think it was Archie Goodwin's maybe way of getting around things, and just Marvel way of getting around stuff, and it was black and white, so I feel I'm on a black and white kick right now, and it feels like there's I feel closer to the art or to the film with black and white.
Hmm.
There's I just to a side, I just saw Nightmare Alley, the black and white version,
Oh wow,
and
how was that?
I really enjoyed it, and I'm a fan of the original, and I
Yeah.
need to go back and get the book, but I'm a big noir buff. But I'm sitting there, and I'm not a huge Guillermo del Toro fan because it sounds like there's a lot of the visuals sometimes overwhelm the story. Even though Blade 2, I think, I could just sit and watch whenever it's on TV. I just think it's amazing. But I'm watching this, and I'm like, if I'm seeing this in color, some of the sequences, I'm like, I just would have been removed. I'm like, that doesn't feel like Carnival of the 1930s,
Right.
Depression
Right.
era. It's too fancy. But in black and white, it brought it down. And then, as somebody was saying in an article I was reading, it made it grittier. The black and white might have hurt when he moves to the city on the next stage of his life, but it really brought the grittiness and sort of Depression era of the Carnival in the black and white version. And now I don't even think I really want to see the original color version stuff because I don't know, it just really got under my skin, which I think was part of the experience and why it made a good experience and why I feel like it was I guess the best experience I've had with the Guillermo del Toro movie, really, ever. I mean,
Yeah.
I understand him as, a visual filmmaker is amazing. He's out of this world. But I'm left cold a lot of times with him. But at this time I felt I engaged with the characters. But getting back to the magazine stuff and getting maybe the magazine, the format, because as I think I was reading and research, just the quality that heavy metal was. And then you look at Epic matching that quality. And
Hmm.
then the ability of storytelling and the mature storytelling, even with Marvel characters in the black and white magazines, Bizarre Adventures, all the stuff, you even had Dracula had a magazine, Conan had a magazine. They were able to sort of trying to still reach out to the adult audience. There was that connection, or that attempt to provide
Absolutely.
stories. But it just, I think, I don't know where I'm going with this right now, but just an elevation of the art form beyond just, you know, comic books for kids. It's
100%.
always been
Definitely.
there since, always been there. Heavy metal helped set it off. And I think people want, Marvel definitely ran with it when heavy metal opened the doors, when they,
Yes, they did. And like you said, that was under Archie Goodwin and I believe Joe Duffy at
mm,
the time. And we actually had an article in one of our recent issues about Epic Magazine and heavy metal. And Joe Duffy was kind to, make some, comments in the article, which was great. So that kind of analysis is interesting. And I do remember really being attracted to those magazines. I think my dad, when I was a kid, my dad wasn't really into the superheroes. He was really into like Deathlock, Scalp Hunter, Sergeant Rock. But I believe I remember him regularly purchasing Savage Sword of Conan, right? And I think it was because it was a magazine, it was more mature. The fact that it was black and white spoke to the kind of pulp entertainment that he probably grew up on, right? And when I think about that now I'm thinking about Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters
Mhm.
that was put out by Fantagraphics, right? And that story is perfect in black and white, right? Like that story shouldn't be colored. And when you're looking at the, the books that IDW is doing with their artist editions,
Mhm.
right? You know, I would love to see Barry Windsor's Smith's Weapon X big in black and white. You know what I mean? So, yeah, the appreciation of art, showing art at a certain scale, that's one thing that's really great about our magazine is that it's bigger,
Mhm.
right? So the art is larger. It has more room to breathe. We like to play with bleeds. So that bigger trim size allows us to have some fun, which is really great. And just, the validity of the magazine, Heavy Metal Magazine has endured through all these changes in the industry, through the disappearance of newsstand distribution, which informed how the market acted and what kind of packaging for content the market made back in the 70s and the 80s. But Heavy Metal Magazine is still here, right? And that speaks to its distinction. That speaks to heavy metal as an iconic brand. And so, actually kind of looping it back, I think about leaving an impression on anyone who picks up an issue. That's something we all do. Like the entire team really just wants to keep upping the ante. So when new management took over, Matthew Medney, the CEO, and David Irwin, the publisher, the new team really came together, and issue 300 was like the new starting point.
Yeah.
Like the resurgence of the magazine began with that issue, and you can see it, right? And the fun is just trying to keep, up the ante or do something different every issue. And that's part of the excitement of doing an anthology month after month.
You mentioned your father, and I know Tim Seeley, in an editor in like issue 102, in an editorial, talks about his parents being working class and reading comics and sort of the magazine. Did you guys ever talk about this? I mean, we talked about your mom, might having an issue seeing you bring in heavy metal, but were your parents an influence on your comic book reading, or was it something you just came about and they said at least he's reading, and understanding what that how comics would eventually just or got were happy that you were reading and saw that you evolved into just somebody who enjoyed reading, because
No, it's a great question, and I'll tell you, I'm always appreciative of the fact that my mother supported me reading almost anything, right?
mm,
Um, I was always, um, I'll say, an above average reader. My mother would always tell people how in the third grade I was reading out of the New York Times. So my reading comprehension was always above average. And my mother, I feel, nurtured that, right? Reading comic books was reading, and I was a voracious reader. And so I think from her perspective, as long as it didn't jam up my academics, then it was fine. And we had a regular ritual where every Friday evening, she would take me to the newsstand and she would buy herself soap opera magazines and she would buy me comic books.
mhm.
So her soap operas were All My Children and One Life to Live. My soap operas were Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes and Justice League of America, right? So she was really supportive in that way. And my dad, interestingly enough, he didn't really feed my comic book reading. He gave me this book. Now, I was in the third grade at the time. He gave me a book. It was, I think it was called The Western Art of Frederick Remington. Frederick Remington was a painter well known for depicting the West. And as a third grader, I really didn't have any interest in it. I was like, okay, I'm going to keep it because my dad gave it to me, but I don't really care about this. I don't care about Westerns. And this style isn't doing anything for me. But later on, I think I got it. Later on, I understood that he was nurturing the artistic side. And I'm so glad that I kept that book. And it's something that I treasure to this day. And so I feel like my parents came at it from two angles. One did it to nurture my reading, and the other one did it to feed my artistic interest. And they both came together really well.
Mhm. Looks like it. Now you're an editor at comics. It looks like it's
Hey,
paid off.
listen, you couldn't have told me because until Milestone, I didn't know what an editor was.
Yeah.
I didn't I didn't know what an editor was until Milestone. I would always see the credit in comics, but I never cared about it. For me, it was like writer, penciler, inker, and maybe colorist. I knew the name Glynis Oliver, and then I think she got married and became Glynis Wine. Um, I knew the name Tajana Wood. I would later on know Steve Olive, Tom Ziuko, but I didn't know what an editor was until Milestone and until Dwayne McDuffie showed me.
And what did what was the first day? When did what was it that they showed you that you realized, okay, this person contributes to to what a comic book is?
Yeah, that's tricky. Um, wow, I couldn't tell you the first day it sunk for
Yeah.
me. I could tell you the first time that thinking about story from an editorial perspective did it. And it was one time, the Milestone offices used to be these three big lofts and they were all connected.
And you came in,
And
I'm sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
but you came in, what was your focus when you came in? Was it as a writer or artist?
when I originally joined Milestone as an intern, my goal was to become a writer,
Okay. So you're looking
right?
at story and comics from that POV.
Exactly. Um, and what happened was one time Dwayne just gathered a bunch of us together, like some interns and some of the younger employees.
That's Dwayne
And
McDuffie? Dwayne
yeah,
McDuffie? Okay.
yeah. And he just, threw out one of his pearls of wisdom and he said, listen, he said he set up a scenario where basically there was a rooftop and there was a criminal on a rooftop and he had someone hostage at gunpoint. And he presented three options: Daredevil, Punisher, and Spider-Man. And he said, what would these characters do? And we all had different answers. And he said, okay, one thing to remember is if you have any two of these characters solving the problem in the same way, you're not writing story, you're writing plot, right? Because Daredevil, Punisher, and Spider-Man are three fundamentally different people. So their solutions are going to be fundamentally different. And that was the first time that I heard about story from an editorial perspective. And so I think that was the beginning for me. And that was before I was in editorial. I started in the business department and I transitioned over to editorial 2 years after getting to Milestone. But that moment, that was, I think that was my first experience with Dwayne McDuffie understanding his genius, and I'll never forget it.
Because he's talking character driven. And it's also something in an interview I read in prepping for this that you were talking about, especially working for Marvel and DC. You're an editor is the sort of the guardian of these characters,
Yes.
that are the lifeblood of these companies. And these companies, for good or bad, really sort of, keep the American comic book industry. They have an influence on us.
Absolutely.
They get asses in seats,
Yep.
and people walking into stores. But he's talking character driven. And I remember in animation, I think I might even had this conversation with Dwayne at a few times I had a chance to meet him, talking about character driven and animation character driven. And we always heard that a lot throughout pitches and stuff. And your comment really sort of nails it. What Dwayne says in that experience that you had really simplifies it, and is a thing I think an editor has to remember, especially working for the big two, because
100%.
that really, you can have the end results can be the same, but how do you get there? And that's all because of the character and the personalities that they are and the history they are and everything. And that really, yeah, that's what it is. And that's what I think keeps people coming back to these characters, is not, you know, defeating the bad guy. It's how they defeat the bad guy, or how their foibles are used against them, or how their strengths, sort of overcome,
Right. And I think as editors, part of what we have to do is, in the caretaking of those characters, understand their strengths and how their conflicts make them stronger. So one thing that you hear different variations on this through the years. You hear people say, well, Superman is so boring, right?
No,
Because he has all these powers, he can do anything. So what's interesting about him? I'm like, okay, well, here's two things that are automatically interesting about Kal-El. He's an orphan and he believes in the sanctity of life. Now, you could say the exact same thing for Batman, and you should.
mm-hmm.
So, right, you start with those two things, that gives you a lot of possibilities, right? Kal-El is an immigrant, right? Kal-El he became entirely disconnected from his heritage. What he has left of his heritage are the archives that were sent with him in the ship and his garb, right? So he was raised by an adopted family with those values sent out into the world, right? So the story of Kal-El is the ultimate immigrant story. And that never becomes obsolete. And that is very interesting, right? And so those are the strengths, right? Superman isn't boring because he's all powerful. Superman is interesting because with all that power, he is amazingly humane. He's interesting because you can't get Superman to take a life, and you can't get Superman to be cynical, which is pretty damn tough.
Yeah.
Right? To not become cynical in the face of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that, speaks to what makes the character interesting. So that's the thing. I think, part of it is we look at these potential conflicts as opportunities to show the character's strengths. I almost don't even like to think in terms of strengths and weaknesses, right? But just really go to, what's your character? What is it that you most want? And what is it that you most fear?
I promise to get back to heavy metal, definitely, because of what we left dangling.
That's okay. It all connects.
But as an editor, and you talk about being the advocate for the creators, but as an editor, do you find, especially with a character like that, and you were an editor on Batman 2, with somebody who's, every story's been told about Batman, but once, as you just hinted at, Batman and Superman are orphans, and then they go different ways.
Right.
Do you have to really sit and push your creators at times? I mean, be very, very vigilant about the upsides they have with these characters. Just what you were talking about, Superman is not a boring character. It's really diving deep enough and really challenging yourself. Did you, as an editor, because of what Dwayne had said about the rooftop scenario and stuff, found yourself like not letting up on the creators that are on the books, and really making sure they're taking advantage of this treasure trove they have in front of them?
Oh yeah. Like, as a Batman editor, I had to help protect Batman. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a story that I never told publicly, which is there's a Grant Morrison Justice League storyline with the Shaggy Man, and Grant Morrison wrote a version in which the Shaggy Man was choking Huntress to death, and Batman picks up a big ass gun and shoots off Shaggy Man's arm. And if you know Batman, you know that guns are anathema to Batman. You know why. So I brought that up, and it led to a conversation with Denny O'Neil, who was Batman Group editor at the time, Dan Raspler, who was Justice League editorial Goomba, and Grant Morrison. And the change was that Batman threw batarangs with explosives, right? But I really thought about the character and said, this character doesn't pick up a gun, right? A gun is the most vile, evil thing imaginable to him, right? So, yeah, sometimes you have to protect the character from a bunch of different directions. And listen, to some degree, I knew that I was doing that at some kind of peril, because it's like, hey, like, in some sense, who am I to say this? But who I am is one of the caretakers of this character who is the most profitable character of the collective intellectual property that is the DC universe. So, yeah, and the thing is, through challenges, we find opportunities, right? So there was an opportunity to still communicate the idea, but to just rejigger your head and do it in a way that was totally in character, right? You get people to challenge themselves. And from a creative standpoint, challenges are exciting.
It's the sort of the trap of the first idea, where you think, oh, I got the great solution, and that was the first thing that come into your head. But then when you really challenge that first idea, that it's like, wait a minute, it falls apart in a way, and there is always, I think, in screenwriting they talk about it, but I think in comics is challenge that first idea all the time, especially when something like that doesn't really jive with Batman. I would think anybody writing would be like, wait, guns are not the thing,
And I think he was actually trying to make a point. I think he was actually trying to show that Batman would pick up a gun to prevent Huntress from getting killed. And I get
see
that.
Yeah, okay.
But again,
yeah,
that again, it's Daredevil, Punisher, Spider-Man, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a Punisher solution. That's not a Batman solution, right? And yeah, when you talk about challenging the first idea, right? I think part of it is kind of like, there's this thing in Buddhism that attachment is pain, right? The attachment to ideas is the agony of our existence, right? And it's being able to let go of the single idea and open yourself up to other possibilities. That's where freedom. That's where some liberation. And I definitely think that applies to creativity.
So let's get back to heavy metal.
Okay.
A simple question for you is, what is the executive editor for Heavy Metal magazine? What does your role as executive editor consist of? You talked about it earlier about, putting, designing a magazine and stuff, but how do you define your job? And you've been at it for what, 2 years, I think now, or almost 2 years as executive editor?
Yep.
Okay.
Just it. Yeah, almost. Because when I started with the company, it was as co-managing editor.
Yeah.
And then after a few months, I was promoted to executive editor. Matthew Medney and David Irwin had that faith in me that I could go to the next level for the company, and I'll always be grateful. And so, my job has a number of aspects. So one of it is the magazine, right? We look at the magazine and we have the magazine mapped out almost a year in advance. And because it's an anthology, there's different stories and different serials. So part of what I have to do is on a daily basis, look at the magazine from a 10,000 foot view and move things around as necessary and look at stories that are ending, an opportunity for new stories to begin, look at the content that we have in each issue from a vertical standpoint, the content that we have going across the year in a horizontal standpoint, and making sure that we are fulfilling the promise of the three genres that are our expertise: science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And additionally, making sure that we have short stories, that we have imported stories that are translated into the English language for the first time, like we did last year with Juan Jimenez's segments, which was a great honor, right? So that's part of it for the magazine. Another part of it is, quality. So making sure that the quality exists at every level. So with myself as executive editor, we have two editors, Morgan Rosenblum, who is also our managing editor, and then Fabrice Sapolsky, a veteran of Humanoids, who really works primarily in finding the global stories and bringing them to heavy metal to be translated into English for the first time. And so working with them, making sure everything's running on schedule, making sure that the quality is good, and asking them, what do you need? How can I help, within the organization? And we have weekly discussions. We have a large editorial meeting every Wednesday, and then we have a micro core editorial meeting every Monday. So that's a part of it. And then another part of it is talking with the CEO, Matthew Medney, and the publisher, David Irwin, about thinking for different things to do with the magazine, different things to do with our different comic book series, because we have comic book series now. Heavy metal is doing more comic book series, I think, than ever before in the history of the company. And so I'm also the co-guardian of the IP, of the various IP of the company, the primary one of which is Tarna, right? So one thing, I've said at the company a number of times is Tarna is our Batman, right? She's the tip of the spear and of that level of importance, right? Her visual, she's there in the 1981 animated film that is the benchmark for so many people in our culture, for so many different generations. And so Tarna is of high importance, right? And so it's interesting, these different things that I was saying about, working on Batman at Milestone, they definitely had to come over when I helped relaunch Tarna, right? We really had to think about, okay, what are the core things that people identify with about the character, and then how can we go further, right? And so how can we bring her into the 21st century while also connecting to that iconic representation that you saw in the 1981 animated film? And I think we did a great job. Stephanie Phillips is an amazing writer. So many great artists: Patrick Zerker, Christian Rosado, Al Barrio Nuevo, colorists, letterers. It really was a team effort. It was a company effort. And so, it really comes down to those three things. It's the 10,000-foot organizational view, it's quality control and working with the editors, and it's IP management. And the IP management is in story, is in the character Bibles. And in that way, I work closely with the publisher and chief creative officer, David Irwin. And then I also do line editing. I do direct editing on various stories in the magazine and for various series that the company puts out, including Tarna and Coldo. So it's kind of like those three layers to the job.
Now, with an anthology, in my limited experience, like in relaunching Metal Hurlant for Humanoids out of LA, is that it's a lot of work.
Hell yes.
And you guys, after issue 300, went monthly. And
yes.
My one question I had to ask is, how do you guys pull it off? Because I mean, I've had this conversation before about the extra work you bring on to an anthology. You know, with a regular comic, you know, you got one team you're dealing with. You guys are probably, I mean, typical heavy metal magazine is about 160 pages, and
144 right now.
oh,
Yes.
144. Okay, so you have 144 pages, and what, maybe half a dozen stories,
Yeah, it
depending
could
on
be anywhere from like 6 to 10 stories. So that's the
yeah,
thing. People feel like, oh, it's one magazine. It's like, it's kind of like 10 mini
10 magazines.
magazines,
Yeah.
right? And so part of that is distributing the work among the editorial team. And part of that is really having a lot of different stories in production so that when one serial ends, then another one will begin no matter where that is in the rotation. Some serials are bi-monthly, right?
Hmm.
Some serials are monthly. So serials work on different frequencies. One of the things that we're really fortunate about is because it's heavy metal, a lot of creators want to work with us,
Yeah.
right? So we get some of the craziest pitches, and that's great, right? This is a place where you should feel like you can be unshackled, right? And so for people to have that kind of freedom, to give them that, to work with them on different ideas, which will, be shared ownership ideas, or to say to someone, listen, you have a crazy Tarna story, just do a 12-page Tarna story, do whatever you want, right? As long as it fits in line with how we're basically depicting Tarna. So we will give them a lot of prep material so they can become familiar with Tarna in her present version. But that's part of how it's done. But really it's also maintenance, right? It's also looking at the status of things day by day, week by week, because real life happens, chaos happens, the pandemic happens,
And
COVID-19 happens,
yeah,
right?
yeah, I know.
And so you have to allow for those kinds of possibilities when you schedule things. And you have to allow yourself the flexibility to say, okay, we were originally going to launch this in May. Let's launch it in June. And let's take another serial and launch it in May, right? So again, that goes to the 10,000-foot view of the year long grid of the magazine.
But I mean, the magazine, you're looking at a year long, but would you think some of the stories you're out there with, especially when you're serializing something, that you might even be further out to have that flexibility of being able to, if something comes up of shifting a story in and out, um, are you almost a year and a half or almost 2 years out at times? Because I know some
It
publishers are
really
a bit tough.
varies. It
Yeah.
depends because we have so many things happening at the same time that some of them will not see print until Q1 or Q2 of 2023. But if they're in production and for some reason we feel like, hey, you know what? This is so far along, we'd like to kickstart it earlier, then we'll do that, right? So again, to have that flexibility is part of the fun and it's part of the challenge, of course, of just managing the whole thing. So, it really comes down to, good teamwork. And so having people that you trust means that you know that the workload as it is, you'll be able to manage it, right? And so that's really important. It is necessary to have people that you trust as part of the team. And right now, our editorial team, the three of us are at the core, myself, Fabrice Sapolsky, and Morgan Rosenblum. And then as you extend outward, we have Keith Champagne, who's the editor of our virus line. We have an editor for special projects. And, you know, depending upon the nature of things, we might bring in a guest editor to do a certain serial. So again, our operation allows for some flexibility, and that really helps when you're talking about not only an anthology magazine, but then you're talking about the different comic book series that are going alongside.
Does what is it, Denton Tipton's Magma? Is
Yes.
that also part of the, the consideration that how can something be launched out of the magazine and then move into his line, or
Yeah,
is that more?
that's different because Magma, as it was set up, was really a separate publisher,
Mm,
and heavy metal is basically like the conduit to the market. So in a way, funny enough, to take it full circle, I would almost equate it with Milestone, the same way Milestone created the content and DC handled publishing and distribution.
okay.
Magma to heavy metal followed the same paradigm, the same model.
I read that in trying to manage this, in your experience with the first year, is that you have, you had serialized series that were going to run 12, and now you're bringing it down. You might be bringing it down to 7 or 8. Why is that?
So part of that is that if we do fewer chapters, then each chapter can have more pages. So
I see.
basically, what that does is it goes against the idea of decompressed storytelling. You could have an 11 chapter story that's 10 pages each, right? Or you could have a 7 chapter story that's 16 pages each, right? And so fewer chapters would give you more content per chapter. So being able to get a bigger dose of the story, I think that also allows the writers some fun. Writers, in my experience, want more pages instead of less pages. And when you're talking about serializing, every chapter has to compel you to come back to the next chapter. So the fewer installments are the fewer cliffhangers that you need to create and the more that you can do in any given installment.
Mhm.
So in a way, it's more fun for the creators. And then another thing is that, when we have the serials completed, then we start going into collected editions. And that's really great. It's really great to see the story come together in that single package. And by doing that, introducing the stories to an audience who is not necessarily comprised of heavy metal magazine aficionados.
Yeah, and I think one thing, like, I just read an interview with Sean Phillips talking about the Reckless series, and
Oh my goodness. Oh
how,
man, I love Reckless.
how he's happy that he doesn't have to stop once a month to do a cover or create an
It's awesome.
artificial cliffhanger. You
It's
know,
awesome. I
he
mean,
just, the creativity, that the flow is like amazing for him.
I cannot imagine the moment when they decided, you know what, let's just go OGM, and how that must have just taken this weight off of them,
Yeah.
right? The idea to say, you know what, we've done the single issue format for so long, let's flip it now and let's go original graphic novel. And just the way, Reckless came out with this really good frequency.
Mhm.
Um, you look forward to an Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips graphic novel in a way that you didn't to an Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips comic book, right? Um, I need to pick up some of the other Reckless graphic novels. Admittedly, I only have the first one, but I loved it.
Yeah,
I loved
there's,
it. I love that packaging.
yeah, it's
I'm a
gorgeous.
child of the '70s and a teenager of the '80s, so I remember this television show called Stingray, which I have to believe Ed and Sean have seen Stingray, and Reckless kind of makes me think of Stingray in that way. So I really love it, and I love the characters.
And it's about time that somebody decided just to steal again from the French. You have heavy metal, and
Listen,
I'm like, working at Humanoids. I'm like, oh wow, finally, 20 years later, where people are just doing graphic novels, just doing. Let's do a, of course, these guys are doing 3 books a year instead of 1 book a year. But I'll live with it. I mean, it's never been an issue of their production and ability to deliver
that's right.
quality and quickly, and a large amount of it. And they're like, what, 200 pages a year, probably easily,
And I
when they
think,
put their projects together.
and it's interesting how the comic book creators pivoted because of change. How, because of how the pandemic transformed our society, they found the opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to be spending more time at home. That means I can produce more. That means that this project that had been gestating for 8 years, but I never had the pocket of time to focus on it, I can do it now, right? And so you know, what happened to our world led to Reckless and led to, I guess, Substack and other things. So I just never cease to be impressed by the resiliency of comic book creators.
But let's talk about resilience, because you guys basically, heavy metal came in, the team that runs heavy metal now came in and started all these plans at when the pandemic kicked in.
That's right.
We're about to hit our third March 13th. So, and hopefully Omicron's just going away and maybe we're lucky this year.
Fingers crossed.
But we'll see. How did it affect you? Now, we're talking about the workload of putting an anthology together of a month. So it's not like you're going out to dinner every night now. It's not like you're being distracted by, hey, let's go to a movie. You're at home, you have a little extra time, did you feel that it enabled you to sort of really take on this challenge of going monthly and releasing an anthology and a monthly, and everything else that you're doing too? Let's,
Right.
on top of that.
I think it definitely helped. And I feel like it gives you more time to seek out more projects, read more pitches. For myself, in addition to being the executive editor of Heavy Metal, I'm also an editorial consultant. So I consult with people on their pitches, their intellectual properties, and I work on different projects with different clients. So it just allowed me to connect with more people in the community and find people who wanted the guidance to sharpen their story and make it better, their ideas. And so that's the thing. It's like this really opened up time in a different way, and it helped create some new relationships that might not have been created in what I'm going to call the old world.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's been pretty interesting. And I think also for me personally, in the early part of the pandemic, my wife and I, got COVID, and we were off grid for 2 weeks, quarantining and self-medicating. And, you just come back from something like that. You're just raring to go because, one of the things that happens in life is you just get caught in the mindset of the treadmill, day in, day out, like the ennui of it, right? But being away for that time, when I came back and I had my full energy back and I was able to re-engage, I re-engaged with a different type of enthusiasm and vigor. And so, yeah, like we kept going because people still needed stories,
Mhm.
right? And we were able to change our operations to adjust to that. And that's where the virus line came from, which, was the brainchild of publisher David Irwin. And other than that, it's been really good. And look at what we're experiencing now. We're experiencing, the global supply chain challenges. With that, we're still maintaining, the monthly schedule of the magazine, which, is something to be proud of. And it just really speaks to our commitment to old fans and new of the magazine, right?
The magazine, I think 300, I remember, was delayed. I think it's something. There was a couple delays at the beginning.
Yeah, what happened was 300, I think, ended up coming out 2 weeks later than originally planned.
Oh,
Or actually, what happened, I think some stores got it, other stores didn't. So it was really weird. I even remember on my Facebook, certain people were saying, "Oh, I didn't get my copies." I was like, "How is that possible?" Because they got their copies. So it was pretty weird. It's wild. Heavy Metal is a kind of company where all the different departments touch one another. So we do have some kind of an awareness, even though I'm really focused on the content. I was really excited when that issue came out, though. But yeah, you're right. It was 1 week late for some retailers, and I think 2 weeks late for other retailers.
And then Diamond shut down, which I know that, with newsstands, and also nobody could go inside a bookstore at one point,
Right.
and to newsstand. And then everything came back, and um, and then the sales for comics took off. Remember, before the supply line issue in the last few months, the industry was experiencing huge bumps in sales.
For the heavy metal readers, what we found is we did have an uptick in readers, and that actually happened. We did a price increase. We went from $9.99 to $13.99, and the thing is, for $13.99, you're getting so much value in heavy metal. And I talked to various retailers, and they just said, you know, not only did that not change anything, but like more people got into heavy metal. And what we were finding is that more retailers were ordering our different comic book series, which was great. So that was very encouraging for us, seeing that happening across the industry with different independent publishers as well. So, with that, our response again was keeping the quality up, right? If you're going to have that kind of extra attention on the magazine, on your books, then you have to earn maintaining that attention, right? So that's, part of it. That's part of the reason why you have to maintain the standard, because the market has become more competitive than ever.
Yes, I was just having a conversation with an interview yesterday about Substack.
Yes.
What's going to happen in 2022, and to look at Substack. And I got into it with the first launch and was following maybe about 5 creators, but I have to back off. There's other things I want to read. Is like, yeah, there's so many options out there.
Yes.
When are we going to reach a saturation point where there's not enough dollars or hours in the day for the consumer, for lack of a better term, or reader, to support all this in one way or another?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's an excellent question. I don't have the 10,000 foot view of the industry to answer it. What I would say is that I think what we are finding out is we're finding out how much people are committed to characters, and how much people are committed to creators, and how much people are collectors. I feel like part of what's happening is we're getting a very clear sense of which bucket someone falls in. And I think that's really important. So, part of the migration of different creators to Substack is, you look at something like Batman and you say, okay, James Tynion IV left Batman. Joshua Williamson is now writing Batman. Did Batman go sideways, or did Batman remain consistent? If Batman remained consistent, how come? Part of that, I would imagine, is because the standard of the artwork continued. That did not dip at all, even though it was an art change. And there's a commitment to the character, which DC Comics recognizes, and they're responding to that by having a certain segment of their publishing be Batman centric, right? We're able to see who are the people who are buying comic books simply for collecting covers by Art Germ, or collecting covers by Jenny Frisone or Alan Qua or Puppeteer Lee. And we're able to see, who just really likes, I guess, certain creators, so X-Men is very interesting, right? Because Jonathan Hickman was at the center of X-Men. He was writing or co-writing a lot of things, and he's now one of the creators that has gone mostly Substack. X-Men, though, seem to be very much on solid ground. They've invited, new writers, and other writers have elevated to more of a status in the structure. Jerry Duggan has risen more. Benjamin Percy is taking Wolverine and expanding more horizontally. Steve Orlando is now one of the writers. So, the whole section that is X-Men, seems to be consistently loved. And so that's very interesting too, I think, just to note this and learn this. And what do we learn from it, right? So from my editorial point of view, part of what I see is that, okay, you know, the character is the foundation, the love of the character. So in approaching Tarna,
Yeah.
no matter where we have Tarna, whether it's a one shot, whether it's a Tarna series, whether Tarna appears in a short and heavy metal magazine, Tarna is a beloved character. And then we have to make sure Tarna is represented with quality, right? And that's kind of like the foundational approach. Now, part of the fun is you can invite different creators to do it, but you know that as long as it's Tarna and as long as it's good, people will follow it. So these are the kinds of things that we learn just looking at the industry, looking at these changes in terms of the consumption, market changes. It's pretty educational, and it behooves us, I think, to just see what's happening around us instead of being so singularly focused on what we're doing.
Now, is Tarna? I came back to heavy metal around 294. A friend of mine gave me a really old heavy metal, sort of torn up the head Mobius, and I'm like reading it. I'm like, why am I not picking this up at the newsstand? Was Tarna something that heavy metal took advantage of? Because whenever I hear heavy metal, typically it's about the creators that were there. So you earlier just mentioned it's character, creator, and collector. So was it sounded like when the new team came in that Tarna was a decision to bring up that character. And one of the things, the downside of an anthology is you don't have the character, the love of the character usually having the readers, driving the readers towards the book. It's more about the creator and stuff like that. So if a creator's not there, you might lose some readers or you might gain some readers if another creator is. So it fluctuates greatly, but a character is a lot more consistent because it was that. Now, do you remember previously, before the new team, that was Tarna, or was this a decision like, let's bring her back, make her be part of the what heavy metal's about, or at least a sort of the not flagship, but sort of
No, in
flag.
this case, flagship applies.
Yeah,
Tarna is our flagship character. It was like a decision. It was a decision that
opportunity that it wasn't taken advantage of earlier. Maybe.
Exactly. If you look at heavy metal before 300, my God, I don't know if there was a Tarna story ever in the magazine. There were a few Tarna covers. I don't think there was ever a Tarna story in the magazine. And there was a Tarna miniseries that did not complete publication. I don't know why. It was before my time. But with this one, in talks with Matthew Medney, CEO, and David Irwin, publisher and chief creative officer, yes, it was a conscious decision. Bring this character back, put this character at the forefront. Whenever we have this character, there's a level of importance, whether it's in the mythology of the character or the quality of the story, right? So when we brought Tarna back, we originally brought her back in issue 300, which was part of a two-part story that Butch Geist illustrated. Still one of the highlights of my editorial career was working with Butch Geist on Birds of Prey. So when I came here to heavy metal, and that was going to be the first story with this updated version of Tarna, Butch was the first person I called. And
you and Fabrice need to work harder on getting more of his European work over to us, because I know he's out there generating a lot of European stuff nowadays.
It's true. It's true. Oh my God, I love Butch's work. So that was in heavy metal 300 and 302, which we've since collected in a one shot. Then we did the series that Stephanie Phillips wrote, which was 6 issues. And then Tarna is going to be coming back in the 45th anniversary issue this April in heavy metal 316. And then we're looking in different ways in which we're going to, keep Tarna as part of just like the soul and the architecture of the company, and she is our flagship character.
So when you came on board, was there a learning curve of all the names and artists and stuff, or I mean, just throughout this conversation, I'm beginning to think maybe there wasn't, because it sounds like you follow a lot of people and a lot of the Europeans and just new names, because the creators on in the magazine, I mean, there's some familiar names for me, but there's other, there's a whole continent and world of creators out there that I've never heard of, but sounds, Heavy Metal Magazine is about bringing these guys, these creators into this one magazine and exposing the readers to a
Hmm.
whole new world. Was there a learning curve for you, or were
I
you
wouldn't
perfect
call it.
for it?
Yeah, it's funny. I wouldn't call it a learning curve because, as you said, I always follow the different artists, but I would call it a curve of experience in terms of, because again, we get so many different stories that it's like, wow, you are literally being exposed to artists who may have never been published in the North American space, by virtue of their works never being in English, or maybe what they're doing in heavy metal, that's their first published story,
Yeah.
right? So that happened. I mean, listen, keeping up with all the names, it's a lot, but part of the fun of being the executive editor is some of these stories I'm editing directly. So I have relationships with these creators. Some of them I'm seeing from a larger view, so I'm learning about them. So it was a curve of experience. I would say this job exposes me to more new artists in a shorter amount of time than any job preceding it,
Mhm.
right? So that's definitely the case. But still, there was a combination of things. When you're talking about Juan Jimenez is one of the godfathers, the fathers of heavy metal, literally. There is no heavy metal without Juan Jimenez, without Mobius, right?
Mhm.
So being able to do segments, I mean, that was an honor and it was proper, right? It was proper. And especially, in light of his tragic passing. I mean,
He was
he
a
passed
victim of
away from
COVID.
COVID a few
Yeah.
months after I had it. It's
Yeah.
just damn tragic, right? Um, and then part of what I did was bringing in some creators from overseas who'd never been in heavy metal, but then they were just able to really do some cool work. Diego Yapur and DC Alonso, who are the artist colorist team on our Sun Eater series and our serial The Rise in the magazine. And they're represented by Butsido Agency. I had been wanting to work with Diego Yapur, I mean, back from the Valiant days. And this was just like the perfect opportunity to do it. Al Barrio Nuevo, who did Act 3 of our Tarna series for us and is wrapping up our serial Savage Circus in the magazine. I loved his work from Detective Comics. He and I worked together for a brief period of time when I was at Lion Forge, and I brought him on board to do the series Astonisher. And I just love how naturalistic his artwork looks. Like, he makes normal life look interesting, right? And that's a skill. That's not automatic. Not a lot of artists can do that. I mean, obviously, Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who is like the deity of making what we'll call ordinary life look just as interesting as the slam bang, right? Butch Geist, who I mentioned before. So being able to have Al come in and Diego come in and being introduced to some new creators like Paolo Armitano, who does Swamp God, Ivan Shavrin, who does Star Word. You know, I mean, that's just part of the fun. Seeing all these different artists and their amazing work and being able to have any given issue of heavy metal be the smorgasbord of all these different styles.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, that's what it is. And I was like thinking, do I ask you about, we lost Juan Jimenez, and
Uh,
also Richard Corbin
yes,
passed away.
yes, yes.
And heavy metal is responsible for Americans knowing about these guys. I don't know. It's like asking who's your favorite child. Is like there's somebody there who's going to fill those vacuums, and you don't know who's filling those vacuums until years later, looking in hindsight. But you know, I don't know. Is there somebody you feel that like there's a new Richard Corbin coming about, or
Wow.
Juan?
I mean,
That's really tough. I don't know if that's even a fair
no,
question.
that's a tough one. Well, so
I don't think
I
it's
think part
fair, actually.
no. So here's part of the thing, right? And you're probably finding this too, is that part of the fun is those people you're going to discover tomorrow. You're going to discover them tomorrow. And in 15 years, they're going to be those new trailblazers, right? In terms of artists that we're working with now, I do have to say, I think Diego Yapur is a beast. You know, there's an artist we also worked with on Tarna named Christian Rosado, who is amazing. It's like, you know, when I looked at Christian Rosado, myself and the publisher, you know, who it made us think of, and this is someone whom Christian admires, and this is someone who we recently lost, which was John Paul Leon.
Oh yeah.
You know, when we saw his work, it immediately gave us that feeling. And so having him do Act 2 of our Tarna series, you know, it was just an amazing experience, right? And so yeah, we don't know who are going to be those next legends, but one thing I love about this industry is there's so much good art out there, right? There really is. Part of the reason why it's hard to decide who's going to lead the way is because there's just so many options.
Yeah. How do you work through your options? I mean, before, you know, we've been on for 90 minutes, so I want to let you have your weekend back.
Okay.
But two questions is
Sure.
like, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, when I open up a issue of, you know, heavy metal, there's so much going on. And that's the appeal, is that, you know, it's just, and that's why I like anthologies. And like, once again, why am I not reading this? And I am reading and I'm enjoying it a great deal, because it's just all these options. As an editor, and this goes back to the anthology and all the work that you have in front of you, and, you know, how do you pick the options? Do you ever question your decisions, or you know, on a monthly schedule, it's like a baseball. You got to go on to the next game. You just make the decision and you learn from it. I mean, how do you, that mind frame you have of, you know, am I making the right call for the survival of this magazine?
Right. No. It's a heavy responsibility. And again, you know, the nature of our company is we're pretty collaborative. So, you know, while I run editorial, you know, I don't have a mentality of making a decision in a vacuum. You know, talk to Chris Longo, who's our associate publisher and chief sales officer. Talk to David Irwin, who's our publisher and chief creative officer. You know, just get different. Hey, what do you think of this person? What do you think of that person? I can tell you that we have a new series coming out written by Christopher Priest called Entropy. It's going to be our big summer event. It took half a year to find the artist for that. Half a year. And it's worth it to wait for the right artist, if you have the freedom to do so. If you're dealing with, I mean, my God, so Ben Abernathy, who's a Batman group editor, is a friend of mine. Like, what he and his team do is amazing, right? The Batman universe keeps going, don't miss a beat, but that must be extremely difficult, right? You know, whereas with this Christopher Priest series, there's time to say, okay, I don't need to find an artist in 3 weeks. If it takes 3 months, it's going to take 3 months, because when it comes out, it's going to be great. But it took 6 months to find this person. But when we found him and the pages started coming in, we knew it was the right decision, right? So the choosing always comes to quality and who is the right fit, who is the right partner, right? Because no two stories are alike, and there are very few artists that can do anything, right? People's strengths lend themselves to certain stories, and also writers, you know, as a writer, you know, and this is something that I've thought about, because funny enough, you mentioned Humanoids, and I wrote a graphic novel for Humanoids.
Yep.
You know, so that was kind of fun, like working at heavy metal and writing for the sister company.
What was that? It was it takes place. It's the rock and roll.
Yeah,
like
it was called MPLS Sound.
Okay.
And it took place during 80s Minneapolis. And, you know, in that situation, it's like, as a writer, you want to work to the strengths of an artist. So before I even started working on, my version of the script, um, Fabrice, who was the editor at the time, and I got on a Zoom call with Meredith Laxton, who's the artist, and I just asked some basic questions like, "Hey, what do you like to draw? What, what parts of story interest you? You know?" And so it's very important to work with writers that will be collaborators with the artists and will say, "Hey, let me write to your strengths. Let me make you part of the process." So that's what it is, right? It's knowing who the right participants are and then really fitting them best with the right stories.
Mhm.
It's not easy. Sometimes you'll get it like that, and sometimes it's going to take a while.
Is there, I guess, one last question? I
Sure.
might have covered this. I don't know. Seeing you're in charge, you have some control over your universe at heavy metal. Is there something, uh, there's three genres that you deal with. Is there something within those three genres that you would like to really get, I mean, like to see more of in heavy metal, or have plans for more of
I would
within?
definitely like us to do more romance.
Ah,
Yeah, I would love to see more romance. I feel like it's a genre that everyone's asking to see more of. Um
mhm,
and I I feel like the great thing about romance is a genre which then fits inside any other genre,
yeah.
right? So I would love to see more fantasy romance, and explore what that means. Um, one thing about the serial we're doing, Starward, with Steve Orlando and Ivan Chavrin, is that's really heavy metal's foray into the young adult story world, right? So, but there's something very distinctive about Starward that wouldn't be the kind of YA story that you would find anywhere else. So, exploring those kinds of themes more, right? I'd like to see us do more of that. So, you know, any creators with any great ideas for a romance story in science fiction, fantasy, or horror, you can find me. I would love, I would love to do more of that.
And it's a genre that comics has a decent history with too. And
Absolutely.
I thought, like one thing when I was running my small, comedy or even romance, it can fit anywhere on any planet at any time with anything else,
Yep.
but it seems like the industry at times never really doesn't take advantage of what's there that's available that might actually, and people touch upon it. I know some people have tried to do some romance books and they seem to be
Hmm.
interesting, but they're just one-offs,
Yeah.
and they're great takes too. They're really unique takes, but nobody comes back to it for some reason.
Yeah. Let's explore that more because, a lot of the stories, no matter what genre they're in, romance is somewhere at the core. I mean, Tom King used romance to ignite Batman,
Mhm.
right? His Batman is the tragic story of Bruce and Selina, right? It's romance at the core. A number of, you know, seminal superhero genre stories are romance stories, right? And so exploring that more would be really great. And exploring that across people from different backgrounds, interspecies, you know, I mean, that's a thing because we're not really dealing with corporate icons that are almost a century old. We have more flexibility to explore a genre like that. And that's part of the fun.
Yeah, the wild idea that heavy metal started out with, the wild ideas are, that's still an element that you guys take advantage of,
Exactly.
you know,
Exactly. So
great
there you
selling
go.
point.
So that's what
Well,
I'd
hey,
like to do.
great, thank you. That's a great answer. I was a little wondering if I'm like, okay. Well, hey, Joe, I'm going to let you have your weekend. So,
All right, all right. I appreciate it, but it's been great ending this work weekend with you.
thank you, thank you. Thank you very much for staying and giving, like an hour and a half of your day. So I really
How?
appreciate it.
No,
So
you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Francis.
You're welcome.